So why would God plant the tree of knowledge in Eden, only to forbid Adam and Eve from eating it? If God wanted humanity to flourish, wouldn't it have made sense just to leave it out completely? Was it some sort of a trap? A test of obedience? Or something much deeper going on in this story? For thousands of years, people have debated this question, and the truth is, most answers just don't go far enough. The tree wasn't just about Adam and Eve, but it was about the foundation of wisdom, of virtue, and what it means to even be human. In this video, we're going to uncover why God planted the tree of knowledge, and by the end of it, you're going to see why this story still matters for your life today. So let's begin. So first, Eden wasn't just a paradise. It was a sacred space where God met humanity. To an ancient Israelite, the garden would have looked a lot like something else, a holy place where divine order was maintained. You see, in the ancient world, temples weren't just buildings. There were places where heaven and earth met. And in every sacred place, there were always divine objects. The Garden of Eden had two of them. It had the tree of life, which represents divine life, and then had the tree of knowledge, which represented divine wisdom. But while life was freely given, divine wisdom had a boundary. Why? Because true wisdom cannot be seized. It must be received. So building on the idea of sacred spaces and divine boundaries, let's delve in to see how these ideas were mirrored in the structures of ancient covenants. Commentators have long recognized that these two sacred objects have connections to the Mosaic tabernacle. Old Testament scholar Kenneth Matthews explains that the two trees in Eden parallel two divine objects in the Mosaic tabernacle. The golden candlestick, or the menorah, was shaped like a tree, symbolizing divine life. And the law of God was represented by the Ten Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant, a moral boundary that Israel was called to follow. And in the same way, the tree of life symbolized divine life, and the tree of knowledge symbolized God's commands. To eat from the latter was to reject God's wisdom and attempt to define good and evil on human terms. What's even more interesting is that Psalm 19:7-9 compares the law to the tree of knowledge, emphasizing that the law is the superior source of wisdom. Just like Israel was called to follow God's commands at Sinai, Adam and Eve were given a command in the garden to be obedient to God, which doing so would lead to life in God's presence, and disobedience would lead to exile. And exile is exactly what happens. Now let's explore how these themes of sacred trees and divine wisdom resonate with similar myths from the ancient Near East. So what's really interesting about the trees is that there's actually some overlap in other ancient texts. Now while the trees don't have any direct connections to anything in the ancient world, they reflect similar themes found in Mesopotamian and Assyrian thought. In Mesopotamian mythology, the story of Adapa in the south wind features a figure similar to Adam, not as the first human, but rather as a representative of humanity. Adapa was a sage and a priest who had wisdom but lacked immortality. He was offered the food and water of life by the god Anu, but he refused it, having been misled by another god, Ea, who told him accepting it would lead to doom. And because of his refusal, not only did Adapa lose the chance for eternal life, but all of humanity shared his fate. So while Adapa was tricked out of immortality, Adam and Eve were not deceived into losing eternal life necessarily. Instead, they actively rejected God's wisdom and attempted to make themselves at the center of everything. Also in Neo-Assyrian texts, a cosmic tree is described in Eridu, a sacred city. This tree, the Giskin tree, stood at the center of creation, binding heaven, earth, and the underworld. It grew from underground waters of the Apsu, symbolizing divine blessing, fertility, stability, The gods Shamash, the sun god, and Tammuz, of life and death, were said to dwell near it. It was also located at the confluence of two rivers, much like how the Garden of Eden was located at the head of four rivers. And what's really fascinating is that a description of this tree can actually be found in Ezekiel 31, where it is compared to the trees of Eden. So we can therefore see that the cosmic tree motif has some overlap with the trees of Genesis. But also in the ancient Near East, sacred trees were widely recognized symbols not just of life, but also of order and cosmic stability. In Assyrian iconography, a sacred tree is often depicted, typically a pomegranate or a date palm, which were symbols of fertility and abundance. The tree was often flanked by winged genies or mythical creatures, reinforcing its divine significance. Sometimes a winged disc appeared above the tree, possibly symbolizing a deity maintaining world order. Unlike in some myths where these trees grant immortality, the Neo-Assyrian tree was more about order than life, a cosmic structure that represented wisdom and stability in creation. And this understanding of this sacred tree as a symbol of order aligns more closely with the tree of knowledge than it does with the tree of life. In the Old Testament, wisdom and order are inseparable. To be wise is to understand and to live within the order God has established. And this means the tree of knowledge wasn't just about knowing good and evil, it was about humanity's place within God's order. So ancient Israel was part of a broader cultural river where themes of sacred gardens, special trees, and wisdom were common motifs. But what we don't have is an account that is being portrayed to Adam and Eve. Rather, it is an account of Adam and Eve portrayed to the ancient Israelites. If it were given to Adam and Eve, we could not meaningfully tie it into ancient Near Eastern culture since Adam and Eve weren't part of that culture. Instead, what we have is a retelling of an account using themes from the ancient Near East. But this is not to say that the trees themselves were not literal, but rather the focus is on the theological significance of these trees. And unlike in other ancient texts, the trees in Genesis don't have these magical powers like these other trees do. Instead, life is gained by being in the presence of God, and wisdom is a gift that only God can give, not by us seizing it on our own terms. And this invites us to reflect on the consequences of trying to seize wisdom and leads us into the next part of our discussion, why boundaries, like those represented by the tree of knowledge, are crucial for maintaining order. So many people assume that not eating from the tree was just an arbitrary rule, but in reality it was actually necessary for maintaining moral order. Think about a speeding law. At first glance, a speed limit might seem a little random. Why is the speed limit 55 miles per hour instead of 60 miles per hour? But the reason the law exists isn't about the number, it's about the consequences. If no one followed speed limits, roads would become chaotic. A small boundary prevents much bigger disasters. And the same is true of the tree of knowledge. The tree wasn't just about eating fruit, it was about establishing order. Without moral boundaries, there's no true freedom, only chaos. And if God had never set a boundary for Adam and Eve, things could have gone a lot worse. So just like speed limits prevent reckless driving, the tree served as a guideline to keep humanity from defining good and evil for themselves too soon. But here's the problem. We don't like boundaries. We like to believe that we can handle power, wisdom, and control on our own terms. Think of Boromir in The Lord of the Rings. He wasn't evil, he was honorable, courageous, and deeply loyal to his people. He saw Gondor struggling against the forces of Sauron, and believed that if he could just use the One Ring, then he could save his kingdom. He convinced himself that he could wield ultimate power for a noble cause, that he could control the very thing that corrupted so many before him. But power doesn't work that way. The moment he tried to take the ring, he began to fall into corruption. And this is exactly what happened in Eden. Adam and Eve weren't wrong for desiring wisdom, but they wanted to seize it for themselves instead of receiving it from God. Like Boromir, they thought that they could handle something too great for them, but their desire to control led to disaster. So if Boromir represents the well-intentioned temptation to seize control, then Saruman represents the full descent into corruption. Saruman was one of the wisest beings in Middle-earth. A leader among the Astari, he was given immense wisdom and responsibility, meant to guide others in resisting Sauron's evil. But instead of using his wisdom for good, he sought to master it for himself. He convinced himself that he had outgrown the need to serve a higher authority, that he was wise enough to forge his own path. And in doing so, he became the very thing he once sought to fight. Like Saruman, Adam and Eve weren't content to trust the wisdom of the one who created them. Instead of living within the order of God, they tried to elevate themselves, to put themselves at the center. And just as Saruman's pursuit of self-exaltation led to his downfall, so did too Adam and Eve's decision to take what was not theirs. And this is the tragedy of human rebellion. The power, the wisdom, and the gifts that God intends to give us freely become our downfall when we try to seize them for ourselves. Adam and Eve were always meant to grow in wisdom, but it was to be through relationship with God, not through self-exaltation. And every day we face that same temptation. Do we trust God's wisdom and receive what He gives in His time, or do we try to seize control, placing ourselves at the center? So why did God put the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden? Because boundaries are necessary for freedom. Because wisdom must be received, not seized. Because pride and selfishness always lead to destruction. The choice Adam and Eve faced in Eden, it's the same choice that we face today. Every day we are invited to trust God's wisdom. We either choose to side with God or take control and put ourselves at the center. So let me ask you, whose wisdom are you going to trust today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to dive even deeper into Genesis, make sure to subscribe because we've got a lot more content planned. If you found value from this video, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. And in the meantime, God bless.